So welcome all. One of my pleasant duties as department chair is to come up and welcome all the friends to the department in this annual event. This event started a long time ago, certainly before my time, as an opportunity to welcome our friends and collaborators and actually brag quite a bit about the department. So I'm not going to spend too much of the time doing that. I hope that you will see all the good things happening, but I would like to make a few remarks. And I would like to say that today we have many good news to share. It might be surprising to people who are not close to us to realize that we're actually growing, even though many hear the bad news about the California economy. In fact, the department is at its largest side ever in terms of faculty, in terms of research funding, in terms of students, both graduate and undergraduate. I have to say that we have started many new initiatives. Many of them, you're going to see them today as you wander around, first of all in the presentations this morning, and later as you wander around in Corey and Soda and Sutarja Dai Hall to see all the good things that we're doing. Many new initiatives. Many of you are familiar with them. The new Swarm Hive, the Visual Computing Intel Science and Technology Center, the Secure Computing ISTC, many new events and programs in energy, the AMP Lab, the fact that we are now finalists for the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing, and many, many other things. The biggest news and the most exciting thing for me as department chair is that we're now hiring again, at least officially. So we have 3 positions to fill this year, and we are in the thick of the hiring process right now. The research budget is at an all-time high at about 70 million. And the interesting thing about that is not just the amount, it is the fact that almost half of it comes from industrial and private support, which is quite unusual, certainly for the campus and certainly for any department of that nature. As you look around today, as you wander in the afternoon in the buildings, you will notice that many things are happening. As you know, a few years ago, we got the opportunity to expand into the Sutarja Dai Hall. And we didn't quite claim it as our own. I cannot say that with the CITRIS director sitting in the audience. But we have plenty of presence there, and that created some interesting opportunities in Soda and Corey. So you will see many new spaces. You can see quite a bit of activity and quite a bit of construction as we take advantage of that opportunity. I got to say that I mentioned energy before. We are expanding into energy in a big way. A few years ago, we started this expansion by winning the NSF STC on low-power electronics. But since then, we moved on with big programs like LOCAL. Now, a very big program in Singapore, dealing with energy efficiency in buildings. And of course, many other umbrella programs like I4Energy with CITRIS, CREST, a program that brings together engineering and policy, and many others. Of course, there is always a fundamental work on photovoltaics and LEDs that we do in the department. On the educational front, I don't know if you will get an opportunity to see that, we do quite a bit of work to keep reforming what we do and taking advantage of new technologies and new ideas. For example, we keep retooling the lower division. We added a brand new degree, a professional degree in the Masters of Engineering, and we invited the first new cohort of students that joined us this past fall, and another bigger cohort is coming next fall. And we are rethinking the role that we play in the classroom. We're taking more and more advantage of technology. We're putting more things online. And in fact, we are designing and we are about to launch the first fully online degree, graduate degree, Master of in Advanced Studies in Integrated Circuits that is going to be launched and go live about a year from now. Students love us, and maybe a little bit too much. It's good to have. We are in the middle of the graduate student selection season. So we had 3,000 applications for about 100 spots. That's a good problem to have to solve. And the undergraduate number of students is increasing dramatically as well, especially in the computer science side, with about 50% increase, 50, in the last 5 years. So lots of things is happening. It's great to have you here. There's lots of excitement. I hope you will feel it, and I hope you will find that your day is very worthwhile to spend here with us. So before I turn it over to the program, I have another very pleasant duty to fulfill, and that is the annual recognition of the people among our students that make us especially proud. So I would like to talk about the 2012 Distinguished Alumni. We do 2 per division, 2 in electrical engineering and 2 in computer science, and I would like to start with the electrical engineers in the group. And I would like to start with Professor Charles Shank. Charles? Hi. So I would like to say a few words about Charles. Charles Shank has spent quite a bit of his adult life on the UC Berkeley campus. After he finished his PhD in electrical engineering, he went on to spend 20 years as a researcher and director at AT&T Bell Labs in New Jersey. There he's done pioneering research, where he introduced the use of short laser pulses in the study of ultrafast events, which take place in a millionth of a billionth of a second. Many, many zeros there. After that, ready for a new challenge, Shank came to Berkeley in 1989 as the director of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where he served until 2004. During his 15-year tenure, Chuck oversaw remarkable growth of the lab. Under his direction, the Berkeley Lab emerged as a leader in the field of supercomputing and joined with 2 other national labs to form the Joint Genome Institute. That was one of the big breakthroughs of the decade, by the way, a major contributor to the coding of the human genome. He was also a faculty member in 3 departments on the Berkeley campus: chemistry, physics, and EECS. And actually, this is not just 3 departments, but 3 colleges, so quite broad. So Chuck makes us all very jealous this morning because he reminds us that he's spending his retirement now in Hawaii. And he has flown from there to be here with us as we honor him as one of our 2012 Distinguished Alumni in Electrical Engineering. And Chuck, if you come forward. So it states that this award is presented to Charles V. Shank for seminal innovations and discoveries in the field of ultrafast phenomena and for understanding outstanding research leadership. Congratulations.
First, I want to thank everyone here for this award. I very much appreciate being honored in this way. Berkeley is a very special place for me. I was an undergraduate, graduate, and a member of the faculty. Virtually every opportunity that I've had in my entire professional life has really in some way been traced to my experience here in Berkeley. I think in addition to the educational experience and the learning experience in EECS, I also had the opportunity to meet wonderful people who were mentors of mine throughout my entire career. And I want to thank everybody for that opportunity, and thank you all for having this award ceremony. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like now to talk about Sehat Sutarja, who's here today. Sehat received his PhD in 1988 in EECS under the direction of Professor Paul Gray, who is also here today, working in the area of analog integrated circuit design. I know Sehat quite well, I would say, and I talked to him at times. And I also read an interview where he said that Sehat told his parents when he was in the sixth grade, that he wanted to work with electronics. And that meant at the time repairing TVs and radios. So growing up in Indonesia, that to his parents probably did not sound as a very ambitious endeavor. It worked out well, though, because today Sehat is one of the founders of the Marvell Technology Group and has served as its president, CEO, and co-chairman of the board of directors since it began, and as chairman of the board since 2003. While his company now has thousands of employees around the world, Sehat, who founded the company together with his wife, Wei Li Dai, who's here today and also a graduate of our department, and his brother Panda Sutarja, who is not here today but is also a graduate of our department, all Berkeley alumni. Started small in 1995 and worked hard. Days, nights, weekends without paying themselves any salary at first, even though I understand that they made up for that by now. Today, in addition to running the company, Serhat is known for participating in Marvell's engineering efforts across analog, video processor, and microprocessor design, and offering input across all of the company's other product lines. Many of my students work at Marvell, and they will attest that Serhat is, as they call it, a fairly hands-on CEO, and they mean it lovingly. So he himself holds more than 150 patents. It is my great pleasure to award him to this distinction, who reads, in recognition for transformational leadership and technical innovation in the semiconductor industry. Serhat?
Thank you. All right, thanks, Chip. Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you for making this possible. And I didn't know there are 3,000 applicants for graduate schools and only 100 got accepted. So I felt really lucky just to get accepted to be in Berkeley. Especially, I don't know if a lot of people knew about this. Okay, actually, I applied to Berkeley when I tried to come to the United States, and I wasn't accepted. It wasn't good enough. So at least I made it up. But I still felt that despite all the years that I worked in electronics, I felt I am just barely scratching the surface. I felt there's so many things in the world that I can do, that I have to do. There's so many things I need to finish. So I felt that this is probably a little bit too early for me to receive. So I promise you that I will work harder to prove that I deserve this award. And hopefully that time will come sometimes in the future. Thank you.
So I'm glad, Serhat, that you're still able to motivate you to go to even bigger things. I would like to introduce Professor David Kaller, Chair of the Computer Science Division, to present the awards for the Computer Science Division.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Kostas. Thank you all for joining us here. Gee, what a difference a year will make. Last year, we were standing room only in pouring rain up there at the International House. So just as Serhat says, now we have more room to grow, and the weather at least will cooperate. Want to thank Dave Patterson and the rest of the IRO team for putting this together and arranging the convenient weather this year. That was a nice addition. So the first of our distinguished alumni on CS side this year is Gaetano Borriello, who is here today. Flew down from Washington, not Maui, I suppose, but it's still nice up there. So Gaetano also graduated in 1988 and took a position on the faculty at the University of Washington, where he currently holds the Jerry Noe Chair in Computer Science and Engineering. And as with all of our alumni, has also led a career that has moved back and forth between academia and industry. One key piece of that was being the founding director for the Intel Research, Washington Research Seattle, but more so, and I think what really has distinguished Gaetano, he's driven the sense of creativity, especially in system design and hardware design, both in the undergraduate structure and now increasingly in serving many parts of the developing world. Much of the tremendous growth we see in ubiquitous computing really has its roots in the work that he's done. But more than that, and the thing that I want to call the attention to today, is his dedicated effort to really bring creative design into the undergraduate curriculum, and that effort has panned out across the entire country and the world. So Gaetano, please join us. So his citation reads, for outstanding teaching and seminal research contributions to embedded system design and their application to critical needs in healthcare in the developed and developing world.
Yeah, I think like the other two before me, and I'm sure Klaus coming up, it was a very rare opportunity to be able to be a student here. And I think the person I probably have to thank the most is Randy Katz, my advisor, who was a new faculty member here himself and took the chance at having me as his first student. And that's always been something I really appreciated. And I want to thank everyone for this award, because obviously the ones that come from your family, the ones that come from the people who know you the best and know where you came from, always matter the most. And I really want to thank everyone for that. Thank you.
And our last distinguished alumni indeed continues that tradition. Klaus Schauser, who is here, was indeed my first student as a brand new faculty member here. He graduated in 1994 and joined the faculty in Santa Barbara, began to really put systems on the map down there. I remember as he agonized, how is it that Berkeley instills in their graduate students that being a faculty member is the highest calling? But he found another calling in forming a company, Expert City, when the cloud was still something in the sky, well, maybe not in Santa Barbara, but, and crowdsourcing was not even on our radar map, much less Mechanical Turk. He really led in creating business models and the technology for both crowdsourcing and software as a service, originally with company Expert City. You may know it through GoToMeeting and GoToMyPC and whatnot. It was acquired by Citrix, became Citrix Online. Now, in conjunction with that, and he's become a serial entrepreneur, or at least is on number 2 with Appfolio, where he co-founded and continues as CTO and chief strategist of really bringing computing technology to the vast mass of process flow. So, Klaus, if you will join us. So his citation reads, for pioneering work in and the commercialization of software as a service and crowdsourcing technology.
It is such an honor to receive this award. Thank you very much. I fondly always remember all my time here at Berkeley. It was a lot of fun, and I learned so much that really helped me later in my life. Jim Gray, one of the other guys that got an award before here, he had always encouraged me to stay in academia. I guess I didn't really listen to that. But I know, and I'm so proud of, there's so many other people I've worked with in the past and people that have taken courses from, including Dave Patterson and Dave Koller and Kathy Yalik and Randy and even my friend Krista Asanovich. And I'm so proud of you guys that you stayed in academia and are still teaching all of the future leaders in computer science. You are doing a marvelous job. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you. And at this point, we'll turn it over to Dave Patterson.
Just for a second, are you going to do the intros or is it All right. So I get to be the vice chair for the Industrial Relations Office. This is a fun job. For the faculty who don't know how to raise funds, I get to explain the magic word, cooperate, participate. That's what it is, participate. And so there'll be faculty asking you if you want to participate. And you'll figure out what that word means later. The size of this program keeps growing. We have to keep finding new venues to fit all of you in. I hope this one works out. I think the sound's going to be better. We're trying a couple of new things besides the theme that we did last year on the big data, and we're going to have great speakers on this, people who are in demand all over. You get to hear them there. We're going to try something different after the break. We've tried panel sessions in the past. My lifetime experience with panel sessions is, 1 in 100 panel sessions is really great. So we're going to try instead to have a kind of a speed dating version where the lead graduate students from 11 centers are going to give up and give 5 minutes about their center, so you can see, how great the graduate students are here still, as well as see what those centers are. And I hope you'll find that interesting and give us feedback if you like that format, so we'll do it in the future. Speaking of teaching, computer science classes are up and to the right. I need to take off to teach 300 students, and then I'm going to skip a class with 100 students. But Armando Fox and I also, as if we weren't working hard enough, are teaching an online class with 62,000 students. So if you talk to me in the break, I'll tell you what that's like. With that, we're going to have our 3 speakers, and I think Kostas will do the introductions.
Thank you. We are already a few minutes behind schedule, and we pride ourselves on being punctual. So without delaying too much, I would like to introduce Professor Claire Tomlin. Claire is going to tell us about big data and autonomous flying vehicles, certainly a very exciting subject. And I will do my best to keep the presentations on time. Claire?
Thank you very much. Thank you to David Patterson, who just disappeared, and the IRO office for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to talk to you all today about really a direction that we're moving into. And I think that's a fair way to talk about big data now. It's something that a lot of us have been working on for a while, yet trying to understand how to incorporate and how to design the algorithms for incorporating big data and what that means into our research and how important that is something that we've been doing. And you're going to hear a bit about that this morning. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that me and my group have been working on. And so this is work today that's in collaboration with some very talented graduate students, undergraduate students, and postdocs here in EECS at Berkeley. So I changed my title a bit. I changed it to Big Data and Control Theory, because while 2 of the stories that I'm going to tell you about are about autonomous vehicles, one of them is not, but it's about control theory, and all 3 of them are about control theory. So very generally, control theory, when we talk about that, what does that mean? Well, it's generally the concept of trying to manipulate a system to get it to do what you want it to do. Okay, so what we usually do first is we represent the system by some kind of mathematical model. And typically we use a model like a differential equation. So what does this equation mean? Basically it means if you have a system, and that system is at a state x, so x represents the state, and you apply a control input, let's call that input u, to the system at that state x at a particular time, and then the world around you applies some kind of disturbance to the system. There's disturbances that we can't represent, so we model them as disturbances. Then that equation describes how the system is going to change. So x dot represents the change in the system. In particular, it's kind of like how the state will move. We can think about it that way. And so the state's going to move and then come to a new value. So we'll call that the new value. And in general, if we take that model, and that model represents the system well, then we can integrate it over time and basically describe a trajectory of the system. And so the point here is that we get to choose the control inputs. We, as control designers, get to choose those inputs u to get the system to do what we want it to do. And we choose those control inputs based on, typically, the representation, the model that we have of the system. Now, that model could be very complicated. So it could be a differential equation, it could be a finite automaton, it could be a set of rules, a set of discrete rules. It could be a combination. So generally, it could be something that has continuous dynamics lumped together in modes. And so, typically we use these kind of hybrid meaning continuous and discrete representations, which combine automata theory with differential equations. So some examples, and so here are 3 examples, and really represent the 3, I would say, vignettes that I'm going to talk about today. In particular, in how we've brought big data into this area of control theory in terms of these 3 examples. The first is high-performance flight. So pilots, when they fly aircraft, they fly them in this kind of hybrid way, that they'll typically simplify the complex procedure of flying an aircraft into sequencing that flight into modes. You change your heading, then you change your altitude, then you change your speed. You try not to do all those things at once unless you're an acrobatic pilot and you're trying to do something very fancy. So Boeing autopilots, for example, are designed as hybrid systems. Air traffic control, that's an even more complex system, and it's something that we've worked on for years. Here you have typically thousands of aircraft over the United States at any given time during the day. And the controller's job is to basically route the aircraft from the origin to the destination safely. So safely means that the aircraft don't come within a certain separation distance of each other. And how do they do this? I mean, it's a human-centered system where controllers are looking at plan view displays of up to 15 aircraft at any given time in their region. And they have to quickly form a representation of those aircraft and talk to the pilots to control the aircraft safely. So they group the aircraft together in their mind. They come up with some cognitive representation of those aircraft, and then they guide the aircraft according to that representation. And the third example, and this is why I changed the title of the talk, is on cancer. It's in biology. And this is something else that we've been working on for years, which is how we can better understand and then hopefully better control protein regulatory networks in biology in general, and in particular in this problem in cancer. And this is a representation of a system where we think that, and we have, building a mathematical model can help us understand the system and, moreover, understand how to treat the system. Okay, and it's interesting because it's much more, if we think about this sequence of examples, we go from kind of small data to bigger data to even bigger data. And how we take that data and actually use it to build a model and, do something sensible is a very interesting research question. Okay, so now let me just go through those 3 stories. And really they're kind of stories with a sense of now how we're taking traditional control theory and kind of changing it with this advent of algorithms for incorporating data on the fly. So we're going to start with high-performance flight. And I'm going to start with another concept in control theory. This is a concept that we and many others have been working on for a while. It's a concept called reachable sets. Okay, so going back to that control theory concept of having a state, designing a control input to get the state, to get the trajectory of the system to do something you want it to do. Well, suppose the something you want the system to do is to stay safe. Okay, so safe could mean that 2 aircraft in a whole group of aircraft never come within a certain distance of each other. So that's collision avoidance. Or it could mean in high-performance flight that an aircraft always remains within its aerodynamic flight envelope. Or in the biological system, it could mean that the control system that you're designing gets the biological system to the desired equilibrium, which represents, in our case, the non-cancerous state. So the idea here is that if we could characterize, so let's sort of think of the reverse problem. Suppose we could characterize what it means to be unsafe, which is that kind of red ellipse representation. And if we could compute all of the states which, for all possible control inputs, the system, the disturbances in the system itself could get unsafe. then we could try to design control algorithms which would keep the system outside of that backwards reachable set. And I've even represented it below as a finite automaton. You're either safe or unsafe, or you're on the boundary. Okay, so that's a concept we can keep in mind. Here's an example of that. Here we have 4 quad rotors. These are autonomous quad rotors in my lab. They're fully autonomous. But right now, for most of the time, they're being piloted by students. So you see 4 students sitting there on the field. And the students are piloting the aircraft through remote control handles. And when the aircraft come within the distance of each other that represents unsafety. Okay, so on the right, you see this kind of representation of the actual data of each aircraft and the backwards reachable set around each aircraft that represents a possible collision with another aircraft. So as soon as the aircraft get onto the boundary of those red sets, the autonomous control takes over and guides the aircraft away from each other, according to that algorithm that we use to design the reachable set. So it's a human-centered system where the control is taken away as the human tries to get the vehicles to collide with each other. And here the students were really trying to get the aircraft to collide with each other. They were fighting against this autonomous algorithm. So this is, 4 aircraft, and this is something that we can do, and we can compute this in real time. So, and it relied on the fact that we had a mathematical model. So we go back to that first slide. We used a mathematical model of those systems to be able to compute those sets and those control algorithms. So these methods that we just presented, they assume that you have a model so that you can do the control. Well, what if you don't have a model? Or what if the model is not well known? And why would that be the case? So maybe the physics aren't well characterized. Actually, even with those quad-rotor aircraft, the aerodynamics, when you get them into certain modes, they're not well characterized, and we have kind of over-approximative models. But other things could cause models to not be well characterized. What if you have a lot of human input into the system? Humans are remarkably non-well characterized. It's hard to build mathematical models like that differential equation model of humans in the loop. In fact, it's really hard to do that. So one of the things we thought about is, could we actually use data? Could we collect data online about a control system like that? Maybe just the dynamics of the system, data which represents those dynamics, and then could we use that to improve the control algorithms? Okay, so what we'd like to do, and we sort of have this goal of safety in mind, is we'd like to learn models and learn control from data, but all the while stay safe. You don't want to crash while you're learning the model because you had a bad model. So we've done this in some cases, and let me just show you sort of the end of this first vignette. We separated the problem. One about safety, so we still have a safety problem, and for that we use a nominal model with error bounds, where the error bounds are big enough to capture anything that we might learn about the system. And then we use our reachable sets. We use model predictive control, which is a standard method in control theory, to compute those reachable sets for safety. So that problem stayed the same as before. But then we learn data online. We capture data as we're flying about the aircraft, and we update that model. And we design a control law which keeps the system inside that reachable set, yet which uses all of that learned data to update the model. So we call this learning-based. We're using machine learning in combination with control theory for safety. Okay, and the idea is really just what I said. We call it an oracle. The oracle is basically the unknown dynamics. The methods that we use are so general that you don't even need to have a mathematical representation of the oracle. It could just be a set of sample data points that you use at each point in time. And so we're maintaining safety with a nominal model. That's the red part. And then we're performing an optimization based on the learned model. That's the blue part. So let me just show you an example, going back to our quad rotor. So let's go back to one of those quad rotors. And let's suppose that we didn't really know the dynamics very well, which we actually don't, but we want to do high performance flight. So we're going to have some physics part of the model, some part that we know, and then we're going to learn the part that we don't know. We're going to try to learn that online, but all the while we want to remain safe. We don't want to crash the aircraft. And so let's just show this. And here I have to actually take a little detour out for some weird movie reason. And I'll show it via sort of a set of movies for this learning-based model predictive control. Okay, so this is Anil Aswani, who's in my lab, and he's the intrepid ball thrower here. And so what we've done is we've taken that algorithm, and we're running it online on board the quadrotor, and we're asking the algorithm to learn things about the system. So here in that first video, the algorithm was learning about ground effect. As you get those quadrotors close to the ground, they're kind of buffeted around by the air from the rotors hitting the ground and banging up. So that's something that we can't characterize well mathematically. We just learn it online. Even if you're doing standard control, so here we're comparing the learning algorithm on the bottom with just standard model predictive control, you end up doing much better because you learn about, again, uncharacterized dynamics like overshoot, and you can see it's much less shaky, much more stable because we're learning this better model of the system. But we can either do, we can even do sort of more maybe high performance things. So we also, in this next video, we told the model, we gave it sort of the wrong parameters. We gave it a covariance matrix about the noise, which was well off what it actually is. So we call this improper learning. We gave it the wrong parameters, yet we still asked it to fly. And even with those very wrong parameters, it started to learn. It didn't have a chance of learning the correct model, yet it still remained safe. And then finally, we wanted to do something a little more eye-catching. So we basically we used learning to teach the quadrotor how to catch balls. So here we put a little cup on top of the quadrotor, and we had Anil stand in the corner of the room and basically throw ping pong balls somewhere in the room. And the quadrotor got to see where the ping pong ball was launched, and then it learned the dynamics of the ping pong ball to position itself correctly so that it would basically reliably catch a number of ping pong ball throws. So it did a very good job of catching, but it also missed a few. And so its misses were actually, we ended up with a lot of sliced ping pong balls as it hit those rotors. Okay, so now let's go to vignette number 2. Okay, so we're gradually increasing in complexity here. We're going from one aircraft, one dynamic system, to now a bunch of aircraft. And so here's a representation, and we've spent a lot of time sitting behind air traffic controllers in the Oakland Center, watching and talking to them about how they represent large numbers of aircraft. Large for a single controller is about 15 aircraft at any given time. And they group them together. They try to put them on jetways flying at the same velocity, so basically that they can consider a whole group of aircraft as one flying vehicle. So we've used our algorithms, those kinds of reachable set algorithms, for a number of things, but we've used them in very controlled scenarios. And here we've assumed that we had a good model of the system. We've performed closely spaced parallel approaches, fully autonomously. This is approaches into San Francisco Airport. And so the idea now is, how do we take those algorithms and apply them when we don't actually have a very good model of the overall system? Because now a controlled air traffic control system is one in which you have the human controller who's actually, a human in the loop controlling the system, and that's what we want to get a good model of. So that's what we want to try to learn over time using data from controllers. So this is sort of describing the importance. So we, even with our current economic situation, the air travel is growing, and it's going to continue to grow. There's a sense that increasing automation, and I think we all probably agree with this, that you don't want to blindly increase the automation in the air traffic control system without keeping well-trained controllers in the loop. And so in order to be able to increase automation cleverly and really introduce automation that keeps the system performing well, we'd like to introduce automation that works well with people, that the controllers and the pilots understand. So we've done some initial studies. This is just taking data over time and kind of learning in very controlled scenarios, like that closely spaced parallel approach, what controllers would do. And here, although I think on the right-hand side, it may not be so clear, but I'll tell you what's going to happen. There's 2 aircraft in this. There's many aircraft, but we're looking at pairs of aircraft. So we have an aircraft that's coming in from, this is a Sector 33 in the Oakland Center. We have an aircraft that's coming in from the east, going west, and it's going to cause a potential conflict with an aircraft coming from the north to the south. And so the controllers are actually going to deviate that aircraft. They look at the situation, they look at the paths of the aircraft, and they choose which aircraft they're going to deviate. Maybe they'll deviate both, and then they deviate that aircraft to keep the aircraft separated. So we built a model which basically was a rule-based system, which based on the state of the system for pairs of aircraft, learned that. And so you can see, and this is where it might not be so clear, there's a red aircraft. Maybe you can see it's moving down now. That's the deviated aircraft. There it's doing what our model suggested. And then on the left-hand side, you compare that with the red line, which is what the air traffic controller actually did. And if you saw that almost collision and that aircraft disappear at the bottom of the screen, don't be worried about that. That wasn't another collision. That was just the aircraft changing altitude. So we're only showing the data above a certain altitude at this point. Okay, so controlled scenario, we have a good model of the system. So what if we don't have a good model? What if we want to increase the number of aircraft we consider? How do we develop a mathematical model or learn a mathematical model when we're interested in these kinds of air traffic controller groupings of aircraft for doing conflict classification and in general doing maneuvering, and thus use that model to provide air traffic controllers with guidance about how they could best control different conflict scenarios. So you can get quite a lot by watching controllers. But if you're developing a quantitative model, and this is what we really want to say here, is that it's very difficult to get the parameters of those models. And the issue really comes down to data. It's hard to, first of all, interview air traffic controllers. They're in a union, so you're not actually allowed to formally go in and talk to them and record what they say. So typically what studies do is they take data from retired controllers, and there are not so many retired controllers. So one problem that we've had is that, even though most experiments use retired controllers, or in some cases they use student volunteers, retired controllers are rare, students get bored, so we have a problem getting real data. So what we did is what anyone would do in this situation now, is we built an app. And we built an Android app. And we put it out, and we asked people to basically play this so we could understand in general how people, not controllers, but how people in general group together moving data and then use that for control purposes. So we built this game called Contrails. You can actually download it right now if you want and play it on your Android phone. And here's just a playback of my student H, who developed the game, playing the game. So you download this, you play it, and the sort of good thing for us is as you're playing this game, all of the data is sent back to us. We capture all of your data, and we've also captured information about what aircraft we're sending out onto the screen that you're basically asked to land. So aircraft are appearing randomly at several points around the screen, and some of them are red for one runway, some of them are blue for another runway, and you basically have to land them without colliding. And you'll see, well, there was a collision. Okay, so we released this last summer. In a typical ATC experiment, so not what we're doing, what studies of humans, factors in air traffic control, typically you'd have about 28 participants, 168 trials. Your base is local US college students, and you have a sort of limited number of airplanes. So we released this last summer, and over the course of 4 months, over last summer into the beginning of the fall, we had 1,300 installs. There were 10,000 games played, and you can sort of see the data, over 10 plus countries. And basically, we have a number of very active people who are playing this a lot and landing a lot of planes. And so right now, we're collecting this data to populate a model of how people group moving data together for the purposes of building models of people interacting with autonomous systems in these kinds of controller-like scenarios. Okay, so the final vignette is even more complex. So now we have a project. This is joint with a number of biologists at Oregon Health and Science University, LBL, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and Stanford, in which we're trying to understand a problem in breast cancer. So what's called HER2-positive breast cancer is about 30% of all breast cancers. And about 15 years ago, there were a number of very promising drugs that were developed. The one that we're studying is called lapatinib. It's not chemotherapy, which is the alternative. It's called a small molecule inhibitor because it binds with the overexpressed protein on the cell membrane, and it inhibits the cancer pathway. And it has very few side effects, unlike chemotherapy. So it's something that was called a miracle drug until it was realized that it only worked for about 30% of these HER2-positive breast cancers. And people didn't understand why. And the plots below are data of the experiment of applying this drug to a particular cancerous cell line. And what was kind of frustrating is that the drug appeared to work very well for the first 2 days, and then the cancer would come back. So it's a remarkably adaptive system that would adapt to the drug and sort of try to overcome the drug, the cancer would. And so here, they came to us because they wanted to build a mathematical model which represented those time dynamics that we could then try to basically understand and change the treatment, change the kind of control. Okay, so now we're really talking about big data. So we had sort of smallish data, bigger data in these three vignettes, and now really big data. Okay, so this is kind of the traditional Western blot. This is quite an old technique for collecting data. And here we don't get much data, tens of data points. But the kinds of measurement technologies that have been developed and are in use today and on the project that we're working on are things like Western blots, reverse phase protein arrays. So here they collect tens of thousands of data points. And something which is fairly new, but we're now using it on this project, is this mass cytometry time of flight, CyTOF. This is with Gary Nolan at Stanford. And here there's tens to hundreds of millions of data points collected in a single experiment. So they can do single cell analysis and look at what proteins are expressed over time. So using this kind of data, we built a model of the system. We built a model that basically represents this HER2-positive network in cancer. And then we started probing the network. So basically, the network model says that there's sort of an equilibrium. As the cell is treated, it tries to protect itself from the treatment by taking some of the receptor inside the cell. And so what we did was we used that model to try to develop a new control scheme, a new treatment scheme. And this is really where control theory came in. It became a steering problem. Rather than just apply one drug, which is typically what's done, you apply two drugs. One for a couple of days to get the system to a state that it's more vulnerable to the second drug, and then a second drug to basically kill the cancer. And so this is what we're now doing. And we tested it in cell lines. So the scheme applied to the standard lapatinib treatment, when you look at apoptosis rates, which is the rate of cell death when you apply the new scheme, is 50%, which is comparable to 11% if you don't use this new scheme. And so now we're taking that, we've tested it in more cell lines, and now we're developing the test procedure in mice. So it was really a method that came out of a model which came out of the large sets of data that we learned the model from. Okay, so with that, I'd like to conclude and say that the perspective of big data from control theory has been a really kind of a refreshing one, I think, from a field that is quite old and is constantly being renewed. So I think the perspective that I have is physics-based models are not always available, in particular for systems that involve human action, where you can't really characterize human action very well. It's better to learn it. Or huge systems, systems like this network in biology that have thousands of variables, and it's very difficult to even get your mind around a physics-based model of that system. And in these cases, I think big data has and will augment our ability to identify, interact with, and control these systems. And I'd just like to conclude by saying a few words about the current things we're working on. We have a large NSF center called Action Webs. So these are controllable sensor webs, where we're looking at a number of different algorithm development of theory in this combining control theory with learning from data. For energy efficient HVAC, this is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning in buildings. Here we're using the learning to learn occupant behavior just from the temperature dynamics that we measure. Energy efficient air traffic control. So basically how to improve or how to decrease the amount of fuel burned per aircraft in the kinds of air traffic control scenarios we talked about. And in general, learning human action from data. And then in biology, I talked about one of the cancer projects, but we're applying this all over the place. We have projects in human development and also in the identification and control of metabolic networks, which is increasingly important in drug design. Thank you very much.
So I think we have time for a few questions, and I would like to ask the people who ask questions to stand up so we can hear you. Yes. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I understand how models are being built. Do you have any insights on how to validate these models with a high degree of reliability, especially in situations like air traffic control?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we, once we build a model, how do we then validate the model? It depends. So in the air traffic control case and in the biological system case, we use one of two methods. So we'll either use cross-validation or bootstrapping. And so typically we identify the model on 10% of the data, and then we validate it on 90% of the data, or a ratio like that. In the online learning for that dynamic system, we're validating the model. We're still using similar methods, but we're actually using that new model online. And so we're kind of validating it I guess in real time in the loop as we're using it.
Probably opening a can of worms, but with your visibility into the role of people in these things, where do you see that going? Do you see how necessary will people be on an ongoing basis, do you think?
I think, again, it depends on the scenario. So the question is, how necessary will people be? And actually, the student, I referred to him, Hao Miao, who designed the contrails experiment. He and I mean, he's a lot younger than me, and he and I have this kind of bet going that in 50 years, we won't have air traffic controllers controlling traffic anymore. So he thinks we won't. I think we will. Because I think that we can't, so especially in the air traffic control scenario, our ability to design autonomy to actually, I mean, you can fly autonomously today, and you know, pilots do, and they have to in order to certify, to keep the aircraft autopilot certified. But in order to be able to prove safety in the sense of proving with respect to the models that we have of the system, of an autonomous control algorithm. You have to be able to have characterized all possible things that could happen. And we don't know how to do that. We lump things together, we try to learn behavior, but we're nowhere near being able to say that we have characterized every possible thing that could happen. And so, if only, I mean, and here we open up a can of worms, because we would like to be able to have people in the loop so that if something goes wrong, they're able to, recover. But you don't actually want people in the loop just for when something goes wrong, because they need to be in the loop and they need to be actively involved in some way. So that's why we're interested, and my belief is that in a safety critical scenario like air traffic control is that we're always going to have humans in the loop. We're going to have pilots and we're going to have air traffic controllers, and their roles are going to be changing. But the kinds of automation that we're going to design, that we should design, and that we will be designing over time, is automation that helps people, that does optimal control, but it keeps the person in the loop in such a way that they're not just brought in as an emergency, look, everything's gone wrong, take over and make the system safe again. So it's a very complicated question, and I don't know the right answer, but I have a feeling of the right pathway to take from this point.
Does big data translate to big CPU? I mean, like in your quadrotor example, is it something that needs lots of CPU power to do it, or is the compute power that you have inside a smartphone enough to do a lot of these kinds of things?
On the quadrotor, the smartphone is complete. The kind of computer we have on board is equivalent to a kind of smartphone computer. That's fine. Air traffic control, it's not that big, because typically we're looking at how a human interacts with aircraft, and we're looking at groups of aircraft that are, localized within a sector of airspace. Within biology, it's a different story. So we are currently working on a whole separate NIH project, which is aimed at how to store, and not only store, I mean, storage I think is okay. It's how to access in an intelligent way all different kinds of data about a particular protein regulatory network, like that cancer network. And so it's not so much the storage, it's the intelligent retrieval for a biologist who's not necessarily, a computer scientist, intelligent retrieval and representation of that data. So you want RPPA, you want CyTOF data, Western blots, you want to be able to see images and then also get the numbers related to the Western blots easily, kind of like a Google map. You'd like to be able to zoom in and get detail and then zoom out and still maintain the general features of that data. And that is an unsolved problem at this point.
Okay, I think this is the last question.
One question, do you think these techniques are generalizable to, say, economic situations where there are a lot of human players, where objective functions are held by separate agents, and in fact there might be a hierarchy of objective functions, like everyone, like the market not crashing?
I'd like to say yes, and in fact 2 of my recent students have gone over to the dark side. They're working on Wall Street now. They worked in control of stochastic PDEs using these methods. So I don't know. I mean, here I think that learning has a huge role, and ability to learn online and immediately use that. So one student is working in these very short-term, like seconds markets. I think there's definitely potential. I just don't know enough about that area to be able to sort of comment intelligently on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So while we switch machines here, I'll introduce our next speaker, David Wagner. As part of doing that, I want to give you a little thought exercise. So think about the growth and the dependence on the information technology infrastructure in social life, in commerce, in government, in society at large. And now extrapolate that dependence out another 10 years, and imagine living in that world with the kind of vulnerabilities that exist today. It's not a very comforting thought. So I'm incredibly happy to have David Wagner taking on that challenge. Brilliant researcher, brilliant teacher. When we talk about service, David takes on things like when the state of California is trying to figure out how to do electronic voting, who did they turn to? But that's not enough. How about the state of Florida? So I was extremely pleased when David was willing to step forward and take on the directorship of the Intel Science and Technology Center on Secure Computing. And of course, all of you understand today, as we look forward at the data that is everywhere in every aspect of our lives, society, commerce, industry, government, and so forth, tackling the underlying secure computing problems are, without question, the challenge of our times. So with that, David.
All right, great. Thank you. It's great to be here. I welcome your energy and enthusiasm, so please feel free to interrupt me if you want. Just shout out, and I'll try to hear you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this new security initiative. What does this have to do with big data? Well, if you care about big data, maybe you have an interest in our computing system being secure. At least if you're collecting your big data from end users, it probably would be a good idea if their systems were secure and trustworthy so they can feel safe computing online. Okay? So we could start by looking at how are we doing at that task. And unfortunately, sad to say, not so good. I'll just give you some examples of news stories from the past year or two that may illustrate the current state of situation in computer security. You may have heard of Google announced that a number of their Gmail users, especially some human rights activists, had their Gmail accounts hacked. Google attributed it seemingly to China. Then Google, not long after that, Google discovered and revealed that not just a few of their users, but in fact the Google internal networks had been successfully breached, attacked a number of systems. And in fact, it wasn't just Google. This was part of a very sophisticated, organized, technically sophisticated campaign to attack dozens of major companies, you name it, the big Silicon Valley companies, to try to penetrate their internal systems. And Google was just the first victim who was brave enough to speak out about it. And in fact, after a little bit more investigation, security researchers discovered that these attacks had been deliberately crafted to target the source code control systems of these companies to try to gain access to their internal source code. Now, you can imagine from a business perspective, if software is core to your business, that's probably not such a good thing to have your core intellectual property going out the door. But from a security perspective, that's also pretty concerning because these attacks were giving whoever's behind it access to the source code, potentially even to alter it, maybe even drop in backdoors. This is pretty serious stuff. Here's another example from the news. RSA, one of the respected leaders in the security field, revealed that their systems had been the target of a successful, sophisticated attack that stole details about their secure ID authentication system. And then within about a week or two, the other shoe dropped that Lockheed Martin had been attacked by a pretty sophisticated attack that then in turn appeared to be using some of those secrets that had been gained from the RSA's internal networks. And they weren't the only one. And these are just some examples of large companies that have come under attack. I don't mean to single out these companies as a kind of a name and shame operation. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm mentioning these specific examples because these are some of the most respected and play a leadership role in security and technology. What does that say if even these extremely competent companies are being successfully attacked in this way? What does that say about the situation for end users? Man, we're putting them in a pretty tough position. And we can look at statistics of attacks and the kind of charts you get. If you look at attacks, the growth of attacks is like some bad business plan. It goes up and to the right. Okay, so this is where the Scrub Center comes in. Scrub is a new center that was launched just last year, the Intel Science and Technology Center for Secure Computing. And one of our goals is we want to do something about this problem. We want to help make computing safer and more secure for end users. Okay? So end users are really our focus. And the model here, I think, is a kind of interesting one. As the director of the Scrub project, Intel has contributed a very generous amount of funding to support the research, but not just funding. One of the things that's quite interesting, I think, about this center is they've contributed 4 of their researchers who come sit with us in Soda Hall just down the hallway from us and are collaborating with us on this project. So I think this is a fascinating model for industry collaboration. We have an open IP policy, so I'm happy to talk to you about everything we do. Please come find me in the break. Okay? So I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the agenda of the center. Now, this is a very new center, so we're in our very early stages. So this will be just some teasers, kind of illustrate some of the directions I expect we'll go. And we have 4 main thrust areas, 4 main research areas that we're tackling, which you can see up here. One is looking at thin intermediation layers that lie close to the hardware to try to provide a trustworthy foundation for computing. So think hypervisors or maybe support in future CPUs. Another is we're looking at mobile security, smartphones, tablets. How do we ensure that that is safe? And how do we try to avoid some of the malware problems that the desktop world is currently plagued with? We're also looking at data-centric security so that as your data is spread out across many servers, stored on the cloud, you can have some control over the data and enforce security policies on it no matter where it's stored. And last, security analytics to try to get visibility into how good a job we're doing at securing our systems. Okay? So I'm going to tell you about some work in each of those areas. All right, so let me start with talking about some of our work on the thin intermediation layer, which is really targeted at trying to make computing on your desktop or your laptop, traditional computer systems, more secure. Right now, malware and spyware is pervasive and is a major problem, and we're really fighting what sometimes feels like a losing battle and trying to fight it. And I thought I'd give you an example to kind of illustrate the situation that end users are in. We'd like to think from the perspective of end users. I want you to imagine you're browsing the web and you stumble across this interesting new website that looks pretty useful to you or looks like it might just be fun. And to use the website says, oh, hey, here, download this, this new program, this .exe, and run it to, get the full benefit of the cool stuff we can provide for you. What do you think? Let me do a show of hands. How many of you install the program and run it so you can try out the website? How many of you say, no thanks, I'm not going to do that? Okay. All right, interesting. All right, so that was really an unfair question in some sense to ask you because as an end user, I just put you in a no-win situation, didn't I? Either you install this program, and that's a pretty risky thing to do. I mean, this website, you don't know who they are, who could be behind that. If their code is buggy, then it could cause your computer to become unreliable, start crashing. If it's has a security problem, then any security problem in that program could be a security breach of your computer, or if it's malicious, then it could do anything that you can do. It could delete all your files, it could trash all of them, it could exfiltrate them to an attacker, it could do arbitrarily nasty things. It could use your computer as a launching off point to try to attack other internal systems. So it's a very unsafe thing to do to use this program. But on the other hand, if we tell users, no, you shouldn't be doing this, then we're basically telling them, I'm sorry, you can't get this useful functionality. And the last thing, if we come to the situation where security people were putting users in a choice between being secure or getting work done, then we failed. That's a failure. Okay? All right, so that's kind of indicative of a more fundamental security problem with the security architecture that underlies modern desktop operating systems. The problem is that our operating systems use a security architecture that's based on a 1970s era threat model, okay? Based on this picture of the world, the mainframe picture of the world, where you have one computer and it's really valuable and it's got lots of users, and the thing you're worried about is that one user might start trying to attack another user and try to gain access to their data. Okay? But that's not the world we live in, right? That's not the threats we face anymore. This is the threat that modern operating systems, multi-user operating systems, Windows, Mac, Linux, you pick it, were all designed to defend against. But it's not the primary threat anymore, because today most of our computers are single-user machines, and that's not really what you have to worry about. You have to worry about malicious data or malicious programs. Okay? And this fundamental problem then contributes to a situation where today we're losing the malware battle, because the consequence of this architecture is that any program you run has the ability to do anything you can do, access to all your files, anything you can do, all of the resources on your computer. And that means if any of your applications has any security bug in it, then the consequences are bad. It means the attacker gets malware that now has access to all your files and all your resources in your entire computer. So it's brittle and fragile architecture. And it also means that if someone can fool you into installing malicious software, then that malicious software gets access to all your files and all your resources without limits. So it means that we're putting users into this kind of a no-win situation where they're at risk from these kind of social engineering con job attacks. Okay? And those two style of attacks are the leading cause of security breaches and malware on end users' machines today, which current operating systems are just not designed very well to defend against. Okay, so what are we doing about this? The idea that we throw away all the operating systems that we use on end user machines and start over doesn't sound very realistic. So instead, the direction we're looking at is if we could establish some layer of trust to build on, some very low-level, trustworthy piece of the system that could provide a basis for protection against malware, then we might be able to help users compute securely in the situations where we need it. I don't know how to solve the malware problem, and we're not even going to try. We're not going to try to eradicate malware because we don't think that's achievable. But what we think might be achievable is enabling users when they need to perform certain critical operations, like maybe doing online banking or certain things that are especially security sensitive, enable them to then enter a secure mode of operation that is protected against malware. So that even if malware has gotten on your machine, okay, maybe it can tamper with your web browsing, but it can't mess with your online banking activity, for instance. Okay, so the goal here is, given that we live in a sea of malware, how do we establish these little islands of trust for the most critical activities we do? And there we're looking at approaches like using hypervisors and these kind of other kind of low-level mechanisms to provide the secure computing environment for those very sensitive operations. Okay, so the benefit to users, if we can make this work, would be helping protect users when they perform the most sensitive operations on their computers. And to give you just kind of a sense of some of the technical direction here, here's how things look today on your desktop. And you'll notice you have a number of applications, and so you may be reading email and clicking on links and surfing YouTube and so on. Well, gee, if there's a vulnerability in any of those programs, if you get successfully attacked, if there's a security hole in your browser and there's some website, some malicious website you go to, exploits that security hole and starts running malicious code in your browser, then because of the current security architecture, the attacker then gains access to all your other applications, and moreover, because today's desktop applications are really not very effective at protecting themselves from attack, that may mean the attacker is actually able to get control of everything on your system. But if we can have this intermediation layer here running beneath the operating system that's simple enough to be trustworthy, then we may be able to prevent the attacker from breaching that. Now, that still doesn't help protect your banking activity, but what we could do is use this intermediation layer to now, instead of running your banking activity on top of the Windows operating system, we establish a separate partition especially for the banking activity that's isolated, and that this intermediation layer is responsible for protecting, for establishing an isolation barrier between the banking thin client and the rest of your desktop activities. Okay, so we have some work on this in this direction that demonstrates proof of concept and shows how it's able to take advantage of services in the cloud to build a much more trustworthy client. I'd love to tell you about that if you're interested. So this is some example direction we're going on to try to provide security for people when they use their desktops and their laptops with current operating systems. We also are looking at mobile security, as I mentioned. And here I think there's a tremendous motivation. We've seen in the past several years a huge growth in third-party apps. One of the things that's really exciting about mobile security is the growth in app stores and end users' use of apps. The other thing that's very interesting from a security perspective about mobile devices is that they're such a key part of your life, that so many of your activities are done through or with the aid of your phone. And as a result, the phone has an awful lot of sensitive information and access to information about your activities from its sensors, its location and microphone and camera, and really would have the ability, if it were compromised, to start spying on you and recording conversations in the vicinity and really causing some quite negative consequences. Okay, so. Given how critical third-party apps are to making phones meet the needs of users, one of the directions that we're working hard on is how to ensure that third-party apps are safe. How to ensure that users can install third-party apps even from untrusted developers who they don't know anything about safely. And we'd like to avoid the current situation in the desktop operating systems where malware is pervasive and security folks, we've sort of given up hope that we can eradicate malware. We'd like to, while the platform is still young, try to design security architectures that can proactively prevent us from ending up in that situation. And at the same time, this is more challenging to support enabling people to run third-party applications on their phone securely, because key to the success of these app stores is that is the long tail effect. Is that it's really important that users be able to install applications from developers that they don't already have a trust relationship with. Okay, not just the Microsofts of the world, the developers with a large brand name and a reputation behind it, but also to open the marketplace up to individual developers in these small shops that most users have never heard of. And if we can do that safely, then we can really grow the market and open up a lot more opportunities for great software, opportunities that aren't really feasible on the desktop because it's not safe on your desktop machine to go install some program that you just heard of from a friend of yours from some random individual developer who you've never heard of and you have no trust relationship with. Not safe on the desktop. Can we make that safe on the phone? Okay. Okay. So, yeah, I think some of these core research challenges are: how do we make third-party apps safe? How do we make app stores robust and helpful at protecting users against malicious or vulnerable or just borderline sketchy apps? And I think this is an exciting paradigm for secure computing because it changes, it reflects the changed threat model, okay? So in particular, I mentioned one of the core shortcomings of the desktop operating system architecture is based on this 1970s era threat model, where it's trying to protect users from other users. And as a consequence, any application you run, I figure, well, we don't need to protect you from yourself, so any application you run has full privileges. Well, the mobile architectures take a very different take on this. They say, look, the new threat model you should be worried about is not other users. You're probably the only user or main user of your phone. The threat you should be concerned about is other apps you install, which may be malicious, or they may be benign and well-intentioned, but because the developer was not a security expert, may have security vulnerabilities, or maybe sketchy grayware that's kind of spying on you in ways that if you knew about, you might not feel quite so comfortable about. Okay? So one of the ways that the new mobile platforms try to address this threat model is by eliminating this assumption that you have full trust in all of your apps. And they do that using a permission system, which means that when you install an application, you as a user are, well, for example, on systems like Android, you're asked to approve the set of permissions that this app will receive. So when developers write an application, their application does not automatically receive access to all of your files and all of your resources and all of the sensors and all of the photos and your location and all of these things on your phone. Instead, the developer is required to state which of those are needed for the application. And when you install an application, this is then shown to you, these permissions are shown to you, and you can then either consent and proceed with installing the application or say, wait a minute, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this anymore. Okay? So this is the model that then is designed to try to help users protect themselves against malicious or buggy applications. And a natural question this raises is, gee, does it work? Does it help? Does it really improve security? Okay. And before mobile systems adopted this paradigm, security folks used to talk about this in the bar, after the conferences late at night, and kind of shoot the breeze and speculate about whether this kind of approach, does it have any hope of working? And you'd get some people who would say, oh my gosh, this will never work. All the developers will just ask for every permission they could ever possibly want, and users will never pay any attention to this. And you get some other people saying, well, maybe it could work. And now we have a chance to find out, because some mobile platforms are starting to adopt this kind of approach to security. So one of the early pieces of research we're doing is studying how well do these permission systems in deployed mobile platforms work for users. Okay? If we want a security system to work, it has to be something that users are able to understand and that is effective for them. So we started by doing a number of user studies to look at how well it works for users, and also to look at developer behavior, how well this works for developers. Okay? For instance, this sphere, will developers ask for every possible permission under the sun just so they don't have to think about security? Well, it turns out that turns out not to be the case. It turns out that hasn't happened. In fact, we've done a survey of Android applications on the marketplace, and we found that the permission system is extremely helpful at reducing the risk if an application should have a security vulnerability, if it should be compromised. The median number of dangerous permissions that Android applications request and receive is about 4. And you can compare that to the equivalent of what they would receive in a desktop-like operating system, where they would automatically get the equivalent of about 56 of Android's dangerous permissions. So that's more than an order of magnitude reduction in the risk level if one of your applications gets compromised. The harm that's done by a security breach is that much less. So that's a very good piece of news. Another piece of good news is that developers really do comply with the system. They don't ask for permissions that they don't need. We've measured the overprivilege rate, and it's surprisingly low. So this seems to work well for developers. Now, how about users? How about end users who are installing applications? Does this system help them? Are they able to understand the permission system? Does it help them make good security decisions? Well, we've performed a number of studies of Android users to understand how they use this permission system. And there the news is a little bit more mixed. Okay, so what we've been finding is that some users are able to use the permission system effectively. Okay, so there is some good news. There's a minority of users, maybe 20% of them, who are aware of the existence of this permission screen. That's a first prerequisite for it to be useful. And then second of all, have at least some level of understanding of what the security permissions on this screen mean and what consequences it might have for their phone. The understanding is pretty imperfect, but we took a very generous grading score, and under a generous notion, maybe about 20% have some of this awareness and comprehension. And about 20% of Android users have at some point in the past decided not to install an application because of the permissions. So they found the permissions useful in avoiding an application and saying, that's not one I want. But that's the good news. But unfortunately, the good news is kind of limited. Because the other thing we found was that for most users, the overwhelming majority of users, this system is not effective at protecting them. Okay? For instance, we watched users as they installed applications, and we discovered that only 17% of them look at this screen. Okay? The remainder of them either ignore it and click right through it, or aren't even aware of it. Something like 40% of users we found aren't even aware that there is a permission system. And in fact, if you observe them install an application and they just, there's this OK, and they immediately press OK, and then right after that you ask them, what was on the previous screen? What did you just do? And they will say something about like, well, I don't know, or I had to click OK, or there was some legalese there, I don't pay any attention to that. Okay? And even the ones who are aware of its existence, most of them don't look at this permission screen. Okay, so that's a first hit against the system. The second one is that even of the folks who do, when they do look at the permission systems, or if they're informed and said, hey, there's a screen there, and that tells you something about security permissions, and then you ask them, well, what do you think that means, or what are the consequences for you? There's very low comprehension. These warnings are really not written in language that end users can understand. They're written by engineers, and it's like they're written for engineers. And we found very poor comprehension, and even under a very generous notion of what we would count as a comprehension, only about a fourth of them have some understanding of what the meaning is. So we have performed some user studies that give us some insight into what's going on here and why the system isn't working for users. But one thing that's very clear from this is that a lot more work is needed to find a good solution that works for users. And I think this is an important lesson for us doing system design, is that if we want a security system that's going to work for end users, we need to spend a lot of time observing users to see what's actually effective. Okay, so I think apps are, this kind of app-based platform is very important to mobile security, but also potentially looking further out, an interesting paradigm for security on the desktop or in other environments as well. So keep an eye on this. We're doing some work on data-centric security, so that as your data flows through a distributed system, for instance, maybe as it's stored on the cloud, processed on the cloud, you can provide consistent protection for your data. consistent security policy that will be applied and passed along with your data as it flows through the system. For instance, here's an architecture we're developing to try to provide end users control over their data based on having a cloud provider provide a platform that supports this kind of security notion. Okay? So in this architecture, users' data would exist in the cloud in encrypted form and is managed by a cloud platform that's responsible for providing trust and security. And the cloud platform encrypts each user's data separately. And when the user wants to interact with some application in the cloud, then the cloud platform authenticates the user, launches an isolated instance of the application for that user, grants the app access to the user's data, access to the decryption keys, but runs the application in an isolated environment that prevents it from exfiltrating the data or, and also limits its ability to do anything with the data that the user didn't approve of. Okay? So this is very early work, but we've started to do some prototypes to demonstrate feasibility on some cloud services. I would love to tell you more about this. We're also working on security analytics, where we'd really like to develop techniques to find a way to measure how secure our systems are. This has been a holy grail in some sense, the security world, for a long time. I don't know what the answer is going to be. I don't have a scheme to propose to you today. We see the huge amount of data that we can gather about what our end systems are doing, and we think there might be some opportunities to perform machine learning to try to learn whether our systems are doing what we want them to do or whether they've been compromised or doing what the attacker wants them to do. I can't tell you what that's going to look like, but one of the pieces of work that we're doing is on making machine learning robust in the presence of an attacker who can try to insert some maliciously crafted training data to try to, for instance, cause your spam filter to become mistrained in a way that the attacker wants, to let the attacker get spam through your spam filter. And I'd love to tell you about that as well during the break if you're interested. Okay, so if you'd like to learn more, come visit us. I hope you'll come visit us at our open house, or come visit Trust, another center here at Berkeley, partner center that's also focused on security, especially security in the public interest and health systems, critical infrastructure, this sort of thing. Or come visit our website and come follow us. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a couple of questions, and the strategy is, we have one there, we got one here, so we'll make sure that the next one has already got a microphone. Please.
Regarding the intermediate layer concept you mentioned at the beginning, how does that compare in terms of pros and cons with, say, putting a sandbox around the areas like the browsers? I'm open to think that if you could attack the sandbox, you could also attack this intermediate layer.
Yeah, in some sense, the intermediate layer is an attempt to build a sandbox around, for instance, critical activities like online banking. I don't think you can do the sandbox around at the application layer. Putting a sandbox around my browser as a whole doesn't really help very much, because so much of the activity I do on my computer is through my browser. My browser is in some sense sort of the new operating system. So, if I go to one malicious website and that causes my browser to get compromised, even if the browser is in a sandbox, now the browser is compromised, that could compromise all my other browsing. But yes, I think that's exactly the right idea. You can think of this as sandboxing most of the activity you do on your computer so that it cannot harm the critical activities in secure mode where you do your online banking, for instance.
It seems like one characteristic of all of these approaches is that data is data. Have you thought at all about people categorizing? This is my social data, these are my goals, this is my financial data, these are my goals around that, this is my writing, I want it to be visible in certain ways, not in others. categorizing the things that we produce in terms of policies so that the access permissions are not based on, chmod, but something more sophisticated?
Absolutely, and I think this is speculation now. I don't have the experiments to prove it, but I suspect that one of the reasons why, for instance, on the mobile Android platform, why the permission system was not working well for many users is that it wasn't put in those kind of terms. It wasn't put in the kind of terms of things that users care about. It was in these very dry engineering technical terms that was not connected to outcomes. Why should I care about this? What is the risk? Well, it might cause my phone to buzz when I'm unhappy. Okay, that's not such a big deal. Or it might cause, my sensitive business data to be breached and become available to an attacker. Whoa, now that's something I'm really unhappy with. So my suspicion is that the path forward is to think more about the kinds of threats that users are really likely to care about, and then if we're asking users to make security policy decisions, to do them in the context where it's relevant and to put it in terms that make sense to them, that in terms of scenarios and consequences rather than technical abstractions.
I had a question about your slide about the number of permissions that various Android apps requested, and it seemed like a very encouraging result that most apps are not over-provisioned. But did you also have results on that sort of normalized based on how frequently various apps were installed?
Yes, we did. Yes, we looked at, for instance, popularity, and we found that there were very few differences. Actually, the popular apps and the less popular apps followed a very similar pattern. There were a few minor differences, but all of them could be explained by the fact that basically the difference between paid and free applications. That free applications are more likely to be ad-supported and so more likely to request permissions that advertising networks would like to have, a location and ability to uniquely identify your phone.
Have you looked at what should be done to improve the security screening that app stores provide?
We've done a little bit of work on well, the first piece of work we've done has been on looking at malware, a survey of all the malware that we've been able to find that has made its way into app stores, whether it's Android or iOS or BlackBerry or Symbian. And there we found actually some interesting results. One of the things we found was has to do with what motivates the malware authors, and perhaps not surprisingly, it's money. And so we were able to characterize what kind of ways the bad guys were using to make money from malicious apps. But the other thing we were able to do was to understand how prevalent malware was on the different app platforms, app stores. And there I found a surprise. It turns out that iOS is doing extremely well. Roughly speaking, they've had no incidents of malware get past the screening. That was a big surprise for me. When I first started this field, I thought, gee, the iPhone model of app review, this kind of ad hoc app review, couldn't possibly scale. And gee, it's got to be so easy to evade. I can't imagine this will possibly work. And yet the numbers, the numbers tell me that I was wrong. Actually, that review is so far been surprisingly effective, and so might well have some role to play in this. So I don't exactly have the answer to your question about what should review look like, but the early data suggests that maybe we shouldn't discount it like I initially had.
Do I see one last one? Great. Gaetano, be our last word.
Yeah, just one quick question, going back to big data. One thing I'd like to know is how many people hit which button when they get those permissions. And then you can start extrapolating that into which are the percentage of people, maybe it's only 1%, that actually know what they're doing, and I would value that even more to know what those people are doing.
Yeah, what are the users doing when they see these permission screens? And of the ones who who are not installing, what are they doing and why, and you could even take that further, which is, could we identify some users who might be especially reliable, and those are ones who I'd especially want to know that, or maybe maybe my cohort, I'm kind of more privacy sensitive than a lot of other people are, so maybe if we could have the system discover that me and my cohort, we tend not to install this kind of app because it's asking for the ability to like take pictures without my consent. Oh my gosh! And yet there's other folks who are, no big deal. I'm just not that concerned about it. Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So our last speaker of this session is Michael Jordan. I guess the joke is he's the Michael Jordan of computer science. But more broadly, I think what I'd like to mention, the role of data is so fundamentally changing all aspects of the institution. Henry Brady's here, Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy. I'm paraphrasing, you can't be a social scientist in the 21st century without doing data. And of course, that's also true. You can't be a biologist, you can't be an astrophysicist, you can't be you can't do science without doing data. And it's very interesting that we've grown this tremendous strength in statistical machine learning, really tying the computing, the data, and the statistics together. And Michael has really been the catalyst of that. So, Michael, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so first slide is to try to convince you that big data is a problem. And I'm not going to really insult your intelligence by trying to convince you of this. Every morning you wake up, you read The Economist, The New York Times, or whatever, there's an article about big data. You go to your office, and probably that's all you talk about all day. It's really the phenomenon of our era. And there's sort of a yin and yang of it. There's two sides of the story, and I'm going to emphasize these two sides. There's an opportunity, and there's a peril. And these are both real. So to take an example of an opportunity, suppose you're a company that ingests vast amounts of credit card data. You have a bunch of customers and they use their credit card. Say you have millions of customers and they use their credit card a lot. Suddenly you have a lot of data that's really interesting. It's about the personalization issue was just raised here. You know when they go to New York the kinds of places they like to stay, the kinds of restaurants they like to go to, and so on and so forth. So you could make offers to them. You could even create a little market where you go to the restaurant owners and the hotel owners and say, so-and-so's coming to town, could you make a 10% discount on them? So the personalization side of the story is really huge. Lots of companies realize they have data about their customers or all kinds of other data that they can turn into a personalization story and reap an enormous benefit from. It doesn't seem like much of a drawback there. I'm going to provide some offers to people, and at least they could delete them if they choose to, but maybe they could take them. So that's happening already. That's going to happen. It'll be more and more targeted. The kind of things you've seen in the news nowadays, Groupon and so on, isn't very targeted, but it's going to become much more valuable and targeted. But let's look a little bit at the flip side of the coin. Every one of you in the near future will have available to you your entire genome, if you choose to. You'll walk into your doctor, and your doctor will say, well, based on that marker at place number 495,602, 3 out of the 5 people that we've seen have that marker have a certain bad disease. So I recommend that you remove your liver. Right? Well, this is going to happen all the time. It's not going to be remove your liver, but it's going to take some drug. It's going to be this or that. And we're all going to have to become statisticians and try to think about, what's the error bars on that? How sure am I about that? What's the bias on that? Is that a real estimate? And so on and so forth. And so there's a real peril that our society is be awash in false positives. And sometimes we're just going to turn that off. We're not going to listen to the doctor. But other times we really have no choice. We're going to have to act in some way, and we're going to have to take this data into account. All right, so that's the real science and technology of big data, is trying to act and think and take advantage of opportunities in this world. Where is it coming from? Again, you can read about it in the newspaper, but big science is one of the main areas. Astronomers are generating petabytes to exabytes of data. And it's a lot of it is for exploratory data analysis, trying to find new phenomena. It's not classical hypothesis testing. But then you have the particle physicists who are trying to do classical hypothesis testing. If there exists a top quark, well, that's some big model. They gather an immense amount of data, and they get a yes or no answer. So both of those kind of activities are present. The other side is a little more related to commerce. A measurement of human activities, social graphs, and so on and so forth are generating massive data sets. created personalization and markets. And then bridging these are sensor networks that measure things in the environment, not just for science purposes, but just for all kinds of other purposes, some of which are human activities and some of which are things about the environment, and bring them all together in this vast sea of data. So that's the kind of the phenomenon. All right, but I'm an academic and an engineer. You tell me about a phenomenon, I'm not going to just look at lots of plots that go up and to the right and think about how big it is, because it's only going to get bigger. That we can agree. In 100 years, it's only going to be bigger. So let's not worry about that. What is the real problem here? It really has to do about getting knowledge out of data. And knowledge means not too many false positives, and you can really base your decisions on it. All right? And we need to do that in a computational infrastructure. All right? So I'm an academic engineer. I want to define the problem, first of all, then where's my scope, and let's actually do something about it. So this talk will actually be about all three of those things. So let's talk about my version of the problem. As an academic, I do get to define the problem. So here's my version of the problem. A computer scientist thinks about the world in terms of resources. That's what we've done for nearly 100 years now. Typically, the resources have been time and space and so on and so forth. All right? Data has not typically been thought of as a resource. Okay? It's really the workload. It's the thing you apply resources to. I have a certain amount of space and time. I apply it to my data. But the whole new phenomenon is that data needs to be viewed as a resource. It's something that's good. It's something that if you get more of, you probably should be happier. It's something you might pay for. You trade off against other resources. Right? It's got to be brought in as a first-class resource with all the other resources. The problem is, though, is that it's a funny kind of resource. It should be the case that the more of it, the better. All right? Just like time or space, I give you more memory, more cycles, you're just happier. There's just no real doubt about that. Right? But I give you more data, you're not necessarily more happy. Okay? And there are two issues here, and I've already alluded to them, but let me get into them a little bit more in detail. I don't believe this is true in our current state of knowledge. More data does not make you actually happier, richer, more sure of anything. So the first one's a somewhat subtle issue, but it's really important. It's the statistical one. But let's think about it like a database person. My data is it has rows and columns. All right? A classical, simple little toy database, I had 1,000 rows. Maybe they're people, and I need a number of columns to make relevant distinctions among the people. Maybe it's their age, their height, their weight, their salary. All right? Interesting enough. But now I've got 3 billion people. I got 3 billion rows. All right? I need a lot more descriptors. I'm going to be interested in a lot more things about people. For example, what books did you buy yesterday? What cities have you visited recently? What is location number 400,000 in your genome? And so on and so forth. There's going to be, billions of columns as well as billions of rows. And the worst part of it is that I'm really interested in all combinations of the columns as possible hypotheses. I'd like to know if you've gone to China recently and you read a certain kind of book and you're over 6 foot, what's the probability you're going to click on that ad? Okay? Because if I know that, I can make money off of that. And there's a lot of real signal in all of those possible columns. Lots of false positives, but lots of real stuff there. Right? And the problem is that the number of such things are exponential in the number of columns. So if the number of rows are growing, the number of columns are growing roughly the same, the number of hypotheses I could be interested in are growing exponentially. All right? And most of them, if I assess them against a finite data set, it's going to give me false positives. All right? That's the problem. That's what big data. It's not just about being big. Right? It's about being greedy. I'm interested in more and more things because I have more and more data there. Way more things. It's only getting worse as data gets bigger. It's not getting better. All right, so that's maybe a subtle issue, but I think it's not sort of realized in society as a whole, but it really is the main issue from my point of view. The other issue is more the computational one. It's a little more obvious, but it's just this, that statistical inference algorithms are algorithms. They run on a computer. Linear regression is, order k squared, k cubed, sorry. If I need to make a decision in an hour, and I run an algorithm, it's going to take a certain amount of time to run. And if the data is of a certain scale, I may be able to run the algorithm in the hour and make my decision. As the data gets larger, I might not be able to run the algorithm anymore in that time frame and make the decision. All right? But I need to make the decision in an hour. All right, so what do? Well, I start throwing away my data so I can run the algorithm. All right? But I don't know how much data to throw away. If I throw away too much data, I'll make a worse decision. All right? If I knew the statistical value of every data point, if it goes as 1 over the square root of the number of data points, that kind of classical regime, then I would know how much data to throw away to keep the quality of my decision the same. But I don't know that in practice. So I'll start throwing away data at some rate, still running my algorithm and making my budget of an hour, but I might be getting worse and worse performance as the number of data points gets large. That happens in real life. I've seen this happen many, many times. All right, so that's also a very big, serious problem. And so I'm embarrassed that we're in this situation. We're in a situation where we have it's no real science or engineering here. We've got all these wonderful algorithms that do all these things. People talk about it all the time, all the opportunities and all that. But we're in a mess, really. Okay, so that's the situation. We've got to work on this. And that's what we're doing at Berkeley. So here's one formulation of the problem. This is just one that I've written down to kind of help guide us, me and my group and my students. Given an inferential goal and a fixed computational budget, so there we both have statistics and computation brought together in one clause, provide a guarantee that the quality of inference will increase monotonically as data accrue without bound. So there's a scaling criterion right up front. I want to never have to face this issue again 100 years later. I want to be able to do this now without bound, and I want inference to only get better as I get more data. And as I've alluded to, that's just not true in our current state of development. But it seems plausibly it should be true. It's a resource. You give me more of it, how could I be more unhappy? How could I do worse if I get more of my resource? All right, so intellectually, I think this is a really wonderful, challenging, deep issue to be working on. So as I've argued, it's far from being achieved in the current state of the literature. And from my point of view, I'm both a computer science and a statistician. I really love this because this really blends my two fields. I think it'll change computer science to make it more data aware, risk aware, uncertainty aware. And it'll change computer statistics to make it more computation aware. And really, it'll end up making these two fields blend entirely, which I think is the future. Now, I don't think that this is a paradox that we can't achieve this. I do believe that eventually this kind of goal can be achieved. We'll have a science and engineering that can make those kind of guarantees, but we're far from that now. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do in the second phase of the talk is tell you about some actual work on this problem. About a year or so ago, I started thinking about how to approach this problem and went back to sort of core statistical thinking, something known as the bootstrap. I'll tell you what that is here if you don't know what it is. It's a beautiful idea. It's a way to assess error bars and other measures of risk on data. It's viewed as a computer-intensive algorithm. It came out in 1979. It's kind of the era when statistics was starting to look at computers more seriously, and it's viewed as a wonderful use of computers. It resamples the data with replacement, roughly speaking, and it does it in parallel, in principle. So you take your original data, and I'll explain this a little bit more in a minute, but a couple hundred times you take the original data, you resample with replacement. You get 200 separate data sets that are resamplings of your original data. Now, in a parallel architecture, I can put that on 200 processors. It's all completely in parallel. Each of them does some statistical work and sends back an answer. You aggregate that to get your notion of confidence in your original estimator. All right, so it seemed like a perfect match to modern cloud computing. And I just envisioned the world full of cloud computers doing the bootstrap. And I still kind of envisage that. Getting error bars on all kinds of quantities. It's a very different perspective than kind of classical databases or stuff. You have here's a query and here's an answer. I want a query and here's an answer with my error bars. You gave me an answer as 10.5. Are you sure that's over 10 or not? Because if it's over 10, I'll make a decision. But if you're not sure it's over 10, I'm not going to make that decision. I want an error bar in everything. And so in principle, Bootstrap provides that, and it's parallelizable. So I thought, great. But there's a kicker, which is, I'll tell you about it here in a minute. This algorithm doesn't scale. It just doesn't at all scale to the kind of problems that we're interested in now. All right, so we started to work on that, and I think we actually have solved this particular problem. So that's why I'm talking about it today. All right, so I've already alluded to this. I'll explain it here in a minute. It requires resampling the data a few hundred times and computing the estimator dependently. That's a beautiful match to modern distributed computing architectures. This seems like a great thing. All right, now if we have a terabyte of data, each resampled data set is, as you can prove, it's not too hard, it's 1 minus e to the minus 1. There's kind of a little piece of calculus here, that a resampled data set, if you resample a data set with replacement, you get 0.63 of the original data set appears. Some data points don't appear, other data points appear multiple times, and on average, 0.63 of your data set occurs. So I have a terabyte of data to start with, and I resample the data a couple hundred times. The problem is each resampling is 632 gigabytes, and I can't distribute that to my separate processors easily, and I'm kind of dead in the water. All right, so let me tell you what the bootstrap is before I go further, just in sort of English. It's really a nice, simple idea. So let's suppose I have a big set of data, and I want to calculate the mean of the data. I'm interested in the central tendency. So I have the weight of a bunch of samples, and I want what's the mean weight. So I can calculate the mean, and suppose I come up with the answer is 10.5. But now you say, well, what's the error bar on that? How sure are you of that 10.5? Well, there's a formula you learn about in elementary statistics. It's called the standard error of the mean, which is that you calculate also the sample standard deviation of your data, and you divide by square root of the number of data points. That quantity is called standard error of the mean. And that you can prove gives you a confidence interval, meaning if you did this multiple times, your interval would cover the truth 95% of the time or whatever you specify. Okay, kind of beautiful classical idea. So that's for the mean, kind of the problem is done. Scales, no problem, it's a formula. What about the median? Well, the median you probably should be using instead of the mean. In fact, it's a better estimator because it's if you have corruption in your data, you know, a data point way out there, the mean will change greatly, the median won't change at all. So you probably should be using the median instead. So you calculate the median on your data, you get 10.8. I ask you, well, is that bigger than 10 for sure? What's your uncertainty about that? There is no formula for the median. All right? And probably if you've not had any background in statistics, you actually, no one in this room knows how to do it, how to get a confidence interval for the median. All right? And so in fact, for many years, statisticians didn't know either. And then by 1979, it was realized how to do this. And the answer is really, really simple. It's the bootstrap. So what you do, remember how to calculate the median of the data. You sort the data and you find the thing in the middle. I mean, there are cheaper ways, there are better ways to do that, but that's sort of one way. So it's a kind of computer science thing to do, calculate the median. All right, so my original data is sitting there, I got the median of it. All right, take that data and resample it with replacement once. Right? I get a new data set now where some of the original data points appear multiple times and some of them don't appear at all. I calculate the median of that. All right, it won't be 10.8 anymore, it'll have moved a little bit. All right, now do it again, and do it 200 times. I've now got 200 medians sitting there, and there's a little spread of them. All right, calculate some measure of that spread, and it turns out that is a provably correct confidence interval for the original median, for the central tendency of the thing that the median is estimating. All right, so that's a beautiful, simple idea. You can now implement it on all kinds of things. It doesn't have to be the median. It can be any predictor you have, a support vector machine, a Gaussian process regression, anything you like, almost anything. All right, so I like to teach that to computer scientists because it says just have a black box and you have a parallel cloud computing thing, you can do the bootstrap and you can get confidence intervals in everything you care about. And that's true, up to this problem here, which is that if you have a terabyte of data, you can't do this. It's dead. Okay, so it hadn't been considered before in the stat literature just because they haven't really worried about terabytes of data. All right, so we have a new project, we have a paper on this, in fact, at this point. Let me recognize my students and postdocs, Ariel, Purna, and Amit, who've been working with me on this for about a year, called the Big Data Bootstrap. So let's get a little bit more formal here, and I'm going to have to worry about my time a little bit. So this is let me actually show you some equations and some thetas and things like that. All right, so what is the bootstrap a little more formally? So I have data, x1 through xn. Let's assume for simplicity that's IID here. All this work goes through for non-IID kind of situations, but let's not do that. All right, so we have a parameter estimate, theta of n. It's just any function of your data. You know, some prediction, some marker is important marker, you know, some probability that someone's going to click on an ad, you know, something that's a function of your data. Let's call it theta n. Right, now I'm interested not just in theta n, I'm interested in an assessment of the risk of theta n, the quality of the estimator theta n. I'm going to call that quantity psi. So typically I get theta n, I'd like to know the error bar around it. That would be the psi for that theta n. Theta n is the point, and psi would be the interval around it. Okay? But this is a more general set of ideas. It's usually called risk. All right, in statistics, there's been, you know, hundreds of years, really, of research on this, quantifying estimator quality. That's really what statisticians are more focused on than the point estimate itself. And they have procedures which are accurate. They are guaranteed to cover with 95% of confidence interval if they tell you, 90% they tell you that, it will do it. They're automatic, meaning you don't have to think about every new problem. You don't have to program it up. It's just ready to go. The procedure works across a wide variety of situations. But they haven't thought about scalability. All right, so there's this notion, statistics, of frequentist statistics. There's two kinds of statistics, Bayesian and frequentist. And the bootstrap is a frequentist idea. It's kind of the ultimate frequentist idea in some ways. And so, you know, if you're not a statistician, this is mysterious. There's two kinds of statistics, Bayesian and frequentist, and it really is true. It's like waves and particles in physics. There are two kinds of physics, and they're both correct, but they're not quite the same, and they argue with each other a little bit. It's the exact same in statistics, and it kind of gives you a little hint that statistics is not a trivial discipline. It's really hard to talk about inference and knowledge in general, and there are two approaches, and they are actually in conflict with each other, and neither one of them will ever go away. They're both correct in some deep sense. All right, so today this is frequentist. So what is the frequentist perspective? Well, it's kind of an engineering perspective, which is that things will work if you do it multiple times. 95% of the time, if you do it, it'll work 95% of the time. All right, so if you had multiple independent data sets of size n, You don't, but pretend you're like the supreme being, and you could generate multiple data sets. All right, then you would calculate your estimate on each data set. All right, and now you would have a bunch of estimator values, and you get your notion of spread. You'd get a confidence interval if you're the supreme being. The supreme being can do anything. They can get confidence intervals. All right, so here's a little picture of doing that. So you have the distribution on the left there, the truth. The supreme being has that. We don't have that. From that distribution, you get data set number 1, number 2, up to number m, and you get your estimator on all of those, and you put them into some formula that gives you a confidence interval, a risk. Okay, so that's what the supreme being can do. We can't do that because we're sitting here on Earth. We don't know the truth. All right, we only have one data set of size n. So what do? We're at a loss. Well, we think about this a little bit. There's what the supreme being has. They have the underlying population from which data is actually coming. We don't have that, but what we have is a sample from that. All right, now that sample is itself an approximation of the population. It came from the population. And there's lots of theory that says that as the number of data points gets large, that sample will approach the population in all kinds of nice senses. Okay? All right, so forget that this came from data. It's just a little histogram. That is a distribution itself. And now you're the supreme being on your planet, and that histogram is the distribution. That's the truth. All right? Now, with that truth, you pretend that that's the population. On your planet, that is the population. And now you generate multiple data sets from that population, and you get your estimator value on each data set. And you get a notion of confidence or spread from doing that exercise. Now, what does it mean to generate data from that histogram? All right? What it really just means is take the original data and resample with replacement. If you just think about it for a minute, that's exactly what it involves. All right? So that is the idea of the bootstrap. But this is a nicer way to say it in some sense. It's just pretend you're the supreme being with a histogram as your population, and then work as if you were the supreme being. All right, so there's a picture of doing that. You have the histogram on the left. You generate multiple resamplings from that a couple of hundred times. You get your spread of estimators, and you calculate risk based on them. So that's called the bootstrap. Brad Efron in 1979 invented that. He got a National Medal of Science for this, among other things. This is not a trivial idea. This is one of the big ideas of our time. All right, I've already alluded to, however, a kicker, which is that if you have a terabyte of data, you can't do this. It's just dead. So that kind of statistics is not going to scale. So what do we do? All right, there's another line of work, and these authors pursued it in the 90s, called subsampling, which seems to solve the problem. And in fact, when we got started on this project, we thought, here's what we're going to do instead when we talk about scalable statistical risk estimation. It's called subsampling. So let's go back. I have the population. I have a sample of size n from it. What does subsampling do? It says take a smaller subsample of size b from that. Okay? Maybe that's a terabyte, and that's like 4 gigabytes. All right. Now I'll calculate your estimator on that thing. You get one value of the estimator, 10.8. All right, but there are many subsets of size b coming from n data points, many of them. So I can do this again. I can do it hundreds of times. And I'm getting a spread of estimator values. All right, so there's my little subsample, and I get a spread. Now, that spread is actually not correct. It's based on samples of size b instead of samples of size n. They're so small that the estimator spread will be too big. You're more uncertain than you think you're more uncertain than you should be. So you got to analytically correct. You got to scale it up. All right, how much do you scale by? Well, if it's a classical estimator, its error goes as 1 over the square root of the number of data points, like the mean. But lots of other estimators, like the maximum over all your hypotheses, don't go like square root. All right, so that makes this procedure less automatic, and so it's not taken over in statistical life. Bootstrap still dominates, but it has been sitting there since the 90s. It has a much more favorable computational profile. All right, so we started trying this out. Even though there was this kind of gotcha, which you needed to know how to scale, we thought, let's just try working with this and see how it goes. So we did here's an example little experiment we did. It's just a linear regression with 100-dimensional covariates, 50,000 data points, student t-distribution for the covariates. We do least squares to estimate parameters, and we calculate a marginal confidence interval for the components of the parameter vector, and we assess accuracy because we did this in simulation. All right. And then the next to last bullet's the important one. We're going to subsample at rate into the gamma. So think gamma 1/2. So we're going to take a square root of the number of data points, say. That's pretty good data reduction for B. Okay, so we can actually run that in parallel. You can actually do this on a real distributed architecture. You can do this procedure. All right, so we did that, and it didn't work. All right. All right, it works in some theory and some asymptotic limit, but for real problem, there was a serious issue. All right, and here's the issue. This is subsampling with different values of that exponent gamma. 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.9, up to 1. At 1, you're not doing any subsampling. All right, so at 0.5, and so this is amount of time on the computer as this procedure, this subsampling procedure is running. You want the error to go down, and eventually it'll stabilize at some value. The bootstrap is the blue curve there, so you sort of get an idea of how fast the bootstrap is converging as a function of these iterations, and then what it's stabilizing at. For a value of exponent of 0.5, which is really a pretty harsh subsampling, you're getting, it's actually failing. The relative error is way up there. It's just no good. All right, you bring that, you subsample a little bit more, 0.6, 0.7, it starts to get better, and eventually at 0.7, 0.8, it actually beats the bootstrap. All right, but then at 0.9, it goes up again and fails again. All right, so there's some range of this exponent where it works, but outside that range, it doesn't work. And you don't know what that range is a priori. You have no idea. And so you would just run this, and you wouldn't know whether I'm in the range, I'm failing or I'm working. All right, so that's no good. That's not an engineering solution to this problem. All right, so that surprised us, and we started to think about how do we actually kind of approach this problem. So we have a new idea. It's called bag of little bootstraps. I'll tell you about that in a minute here. And to motivate this, let's go back to this subsampling perspective for a minute. So remember, we had the population. Only the supreme being gets to know that. We have the n data points, which was the focus of our analysis, and we took a subsample of size b. But now forget that there was that intermediate stage of getting n data points and reducing to b. Just think about those b points. They come also from the population. They're a random sample from the population. Okay? They just went through an intermediate stage, but they're a random sample from the population. So the same argument about them being an approximation of the underlying population still holds. Now, my little drawing is not very revealing. It shows like 10 data points. It looks like a bad approximation, but you know, think about B as 4 gigabytes. It's probably going to be a pretty good approximation too. Okay, so now forget that this came from data at all. It's just a little histogram. It's a distribution, and you can sample from that distribution with replacement. But don't do it B times. That would be wrong. That would be back to the old idea. Do that N times. And so that's the new idea. You take a little distribution that has support on B points, which is a small number. You resample with replacement n times. And now you're getting fluctuations to the right scale of n, which is what you care about. You're not going to have to rescale under this approach. All right, now the stupid thing to do here would be take your B points, B is small, so I'd send it off to processor number 1. It's got this small number of points. And resample with replacement n times, you would then fill out and get back to a terabyte of data. That would be a bad idea. But you don't want to do that because your support is only on B points. Some of them will get sampled many times, others not at all. Keep a count for every data point of how many times it's resampled. So your memory profile stays at size B. And it turns out almost all the algorithms we care about have weighted versions. That you can do weighted least squares and weighted support vector machine and weighted quantiles and blah, blah, blah. All right, so the computational cost of working with n data points, virtual data points, still scales at size B. So the local processor is happy. The bandwidth to get to the processor is happy because it's only B data points, and we still have to do this only 200 times. So it fits cloud computing. All right, so I said all of the whole idea. That's it. That's the whole idea. And I have a couple of slides to sort of say this again. Again, you remember you have this notion of an approximation. Erase the underlying population, which you don't know about. You take the subsample, you pretend it's the population. On your planet, that's the population, on your local processor. Sample from it with replacement, but do it n times, not b. All right, so here's a little bit of pseudocode. You repeatedly, for each subsample, that's on one processor, you take your subsample and you repeatedly sample n points with replacement from the subsample. You calculate your estimator on that thing, and that's the bootstrap on that little local subsample. Then I do the bootstrap on another subsample here and here and here. I do 200 bootstraps on little tiny subsamples, where each bootstrap is based on n data points, so it's a correct bootstrap. All right, and then I'm going to bring them all back together and average them. And that's the idea. So here's a picture. It's a doubly nested loop. You take the original data, you subsample, send it out to your separate processors. Each one of them does the bootstrap locally, and then you bring that all back together to get your notion of risk. All right, so hopefully you got that idea. It's really, it's first, it's a simple idea, but there have been thousands of papers written about the bootstrap since 1979, literally thousands. And this idea is new, so kind of surprising to me. So bag of little bootstraps, hope that's clear why. The bag is 200. And little bootstrap refers to working on a small amount of data on each local processor. All right, so does this work? Here's a picture showing you that, yes, this works. So this is engineering ready to go. Here's the same picture as before. The relative error is a function of time. The bootstrap itself is in blue. And then for all values of the exponent between 0.5 and 1, this actually beats the bootstrap. So actually I would use this instead of the bootstrap even on small problems. It actually is more efficient use of data than the bootstrap. Okay, so I'm basically done. I had some extra slides here, which I've included. If anyone wants the slides, that has the theory. So this has a whole theory of, we can tell you why it's beating the bootstrap. We can talk about the rate of convergence. We can guarantee convergence, and we have a whole set of theory about that. And that is on these slides, so just to show you that we can do equations at Berkeley as well. There is a statement of a theorem about correctness, and then there's a statement about something called consistency. And there's even something about higher order correctness. In fact, just kind of for the mathematically inclined in the audience, you probably know what the central limit theorem is. It guarantees that estimators have a certain rate of convergence, which goes like a Gaussian, basically. And it turns out goes as 1 over square root of n. That's what I've been kind of talking about. The bootstrap, in many, many situations, goes faster than that. It goes as 1 over n. And it's one of the beautiful facts about the bootstrap. It beats the central limit theorem, which was a big surprise when it first came out. And one of the main reasons statisticians cared about it. They weren't so interested in computational issues. And so we had to prove that the BLB actually still beats the central limit theorem, and it does. So that statement is sitting right up there. Well, I think it's on the next slide, actually. Yeah, that little OP of 1 over n is that reassurance. All right. So there you go. That was my sort of attempt to frame the big data problem. What is the academic intellectual problem and really the societal problem that we're all facing? And hash out a little bit of the attempts to bring statistical thinking together with computational thinking. Really, what we're doing is, in some sense, divide and conquer. We're dividing a problem up into little pieces, solving the pieces independently, and bringing them back together. Classical computational paradigm. And what I kind of like about that is that that's kind of the antithesis of the statistical paradigm. Statistics is about integrating, bringing things together, and showing that when you add things up, it gets simpler, and you get nicer performance. So in some sense, computational ideas and statistical thinking have not been brought together that much because they're kind of in conflict. Computer scientists like to divide things into pieces, make them simpler. Statisticians like to bring them together. But again, I think that's a false paradox. There actually is, there's ways to think about both paradigms together, and this is an example. All right, so let me just make a couple of last points and I'll finish. I've told you a little bit about this BLB. I'd be happy to talk offline. There are lots of other areas that we're pursuing with this. We have a technical report available. And also let me mention that this research is being conducted inside of what's called the AMP lab here at Berkeley, Algorithms, Machines, and People. You'll hear more about that later in this next session. Michael Armbrust, one of the students in the AMP lab, will be telling you more about the AMP lab. Algorithms is really the kind of things you've been hearing about today. That's me and my group working on machine learning ideas at scale. And machines is several of our systems faculty working about how to take data analytics and really make scalable systems, a whole stack that does this kind of statistical work at scale. And the people side is really about crowd and accessing crowd information for making statistical estimation better and then also measuring human activity. So the lab tries to bring all those together, and I'd encourage you to come visit. There's an open house this afternoon, and there'll be posters. In fact, the other authors here on this BLB will be presenting a poster on it if you want to talk to the students who've been doing that work. So thanks very much.
We have time for a couple of questions before we take a break.
How dependent is the BLB method on your ability to take good samples from your little...
How dependent is BLB on kind of representativeness of samples? Yeah, that's a great question. The theory gives you a certain degree of robustness. But, sampling is a whole theory of itself. How do you do a census? It's kind of, you can imagine there's been 100 years of work on that. In fact, Laplace, one of the original statisticians in 1800, that's what he was working on, is how to do the census. And they have a lot of ideas there. And so you get representative samples by stratifying. There's things called importance sampling. There's a whole literature on sampling. All right, so when I talked about sample with replacement uniformly, in some ways I was just trying to be a nice teacher, teach you the simplest thing first. But to roll this out and really make it really, really robust and really get the best you can out of your data, you would want to use those kind of ideas from sampling theory. Also, lots of data are not IID, they're time series, they're graphical, they have dependencies, and you have to sample in a way that respects those dependencies. If you start to lose them in the sampling, you won't recover them in the estimation. So you have to do that, and you can do that. The whole theory of the bootstrap has lots of examples of sampling under dependent data as well. So there's a whole technology, which, it's part of our agenda here to kind of bring the good pieces of that together with computation. But great question. Thank you. Kostas. Yes.
I was surprised to hear that he took Monte Carlo simulations to find out that subsampling didn't work. Was that true?
He's asking, it took Monte Carlo to find out this didn't work. Yeah, it's true. Monte Carlo is still one of our major tools. Simulate and learn things, because when you simulate, you can be the supreme being. You know the truth, and you can compare how far you're off the truth. If you just do this on real data, you got some answer. You don't know, could you have done better? Are you doing terribly? What's the floor? And so, a lot of this is Monte Carlo. Now, we do tons of math where you do asymptotics and use Edgeworth expansions and empirical process theory, blah, blah, blah. But in all that math, you often make pretty strong assumptions, and they aren't necessarily appropriate for a massive data world. Again, this issue, the classical statistician, I have a terabyte of data, that means n's a terabyte? That means my error bars are tiny. Statistics is trivial. Law of large numbers applies. I don't need for this. And my first slide was trying to convince you that's completely wrong. Because as the number of data points gets large, the number of columns gets large, the number of hypotheses you're looking at blows up exponentially. And so the amount of data support for any hypothesis is a fraction of what you would need. And so statistical power is going to 0. All right? And so the asymptotics that one classically did in statistics does not apply to that situation. People are now working on, people here at Berkeley in particular, Martin Wainwright is an expert on this, working on modern asymptotics where the number of hypotheses is going up exponentially in the number of data points. So there are both of those. But Monte Carlo is still a fantastic tool for discovering these kind of things.
So, Michael, in your formulation, you had a fixed inferential goal.
Yes.
And a fixed computational budget.
Yes.
And we're looking at what happens with increasing amounts of data.
Yes.
Could you think of, is there a dual formulation where your inferential goal becomes more and more refined?
Yes.
In what way would computation need to grow in order to give you answers to that to the same level of reliability?
Yeah, great question. Precisely, there is that dual problem. It's just as good a problem to be looking at.
Formulating that?
It's the more classical statistical goal. It is the one that you would see.
That already exists?
Yeah, this department, LaCom, worked on that for many years. It's kind of the more classical goal. And we find it kind of less helpful in understanding these problems. Also, because an inferential goal doesn't mean just like calculating one number. It means like, what's the, of all the hypotheses you're looking at, what's the worst one that, control that. Make sure you're not making a false positive on any of them. That's an inferential goal, but over many hypotheses.
I'm thinking of your original formulation.
No, I know you are.
Where you talked about the person who's going to China reading a certain book. And what's the
That's right. No, any trade-off you can express as keeping one thing constant and then looking at the other curve, or vice versa, or letting them both grow in some way jointly. And all those things are good. That was just one attempt to make a concrete goal that can guide us. But you're absolutely right. We also look at the duals of those as well. Yes. Yes.
I think we have one here and one back there. Go ahead.
So that was a really good talk about the theory of big data and how to scale it and reduce it to size. It seems like it would have pretty significant applications. Have you applied it to anything, and have you seen results that are positive?
Yeah, so that's the whole agenda of the AMP Lab, is to really roll this out as a platform that you can download and use. And we also then have application partners in-house. We're working on some transportation problems, some urban planning problems. There's a cancer genomics problem, which we're targeting as applications to sort of roll these things out. Because I firmly believe you have to work with the real problem with the people who care about it so that you start to see what really you need to solve. But these are early days. That paper was published about a month ago. And right now, the simulations I showed you were on one processor. The main goal right now, what we're doing, in fact, as of today, there are new results, is doing the full distributed implementation on something on top of a version, Berkeley internal version of Hadoop, a statistically machine learning sophisticated version of Hadoop. And so there are now experiments at a terabyte being really done in a distributed infrastructure. So once that's available, it can be used on EC2. I really expect people to start using it. I mean, in fact, our systems people have put it inside of the actual data analytics stack already. As a statistician, I'm also happy I don't have to demonstrate the application. I do something, I try to convince people, and they use it, and that's how the world goes forward.
Maybe our last one here.
Is there any way that these techniques of sort of making Bootstrap more computationally feasible work backwards and inform experimental design in terms of when there's a cost function, or even the more general case where as things develop, new columns get added to the table for some of the new entries?
Yeah, that's a great question to close on. That's really one of the major agendas of our time, is kind of closing the loop. It's really control theory meets statistics. About you've got certain error bars, either a priori or a posteriori, which the Bootstrap gives you, and you're not happy with those error bars. what do you do? How do you collect more data? How do you sample, but also how do you collect more data in a closed loop way so that you drive down the kind of error bars you need to drive down? And that is the field of experimental design, and that field exists too, but it's even further away from computational reality. It turns out those problems, most of them can be formulated as the problem of, let me get this right, maximizing a convex function over a convex set. All right, so think about a convex set and a convex function. All the corners are possible solutions. It's the worst problem. It's a nasty, nasty problem. And so the algorithm solutions don't scale at all. So it's really far from practice. So that is a major intellectual agenda item of kind of figuring ways around those issues, how to do experimental design at scale.
Thank you.